Hello, how you doing? And welcome back to the channel. The Rugby Championship gets underway this weekend, so that's what I'm going to look ahead to in this video. A little preview, I'll go through each of the teams and just mention a few points that I think are interesting, things that I'm looking forward to finding out ahead of it getting underway at the weekend. So drop a comment down below. Who do you think is going to win it? I actually think it's kind of hard to predict for reasons I'll get into at the start of the video, but you can have your say in the comments. Like the video and subscribe to the channel as well. But let's get into it. So I say there that it's hard to predict. What I mean by that, and this is something I mentioned in the video I did about the New Zealand squad the other day, is I think the context of the World Cup later this year completely changes the context of the Rugby Championship because it's so close to the start of the World Cup, which is just a couple of months away, that I think it might change how we see teams approach this tournament, in that I think we could see at times squad rotation. I know that Jacques Nienaber, Ian Foster have both spoken about it in that it is a stepping stone, it is a building block on the way to the World Cup as teams look to peak for the tournament in France. So therefore, I think it's hard to know exactly what sort of sides we're going to see. For example, New Zealand, their first game away to Argentina. On paper, in terms of opposition, Argentina would be the weakest of the sides that they're probably going to face. So would they rotate there and then maybe look to have a stronger squad for facing South Africa at home and Australia away? And that goes for all the sides really in the competition. I think particularly for the All Blacks and the Springboks, how they rotate their squads is going to be interesting. And therefore, I think it does make it just a little bit harder to predict who might win the tournament. Overall, though, those two sides that I've mentioned, South Africa and New Zealand, I think, are the favourites. They're the two strongest squads in the competition. There's uncertainty around Australia, and as good as Argentina are, and when I get onto them I'll speak about some of the results they've also had a pretty disappointing end to last year, so still some question marks over Michael Cheika's side. So that's why I think it's particularly difficult to predict this Rugby Championship, but I also do think it makes it really fascinating. I think the fact that the World Cup is coming up on the horizon pretty quickly, I think it just adds a layer of intrigue to what we see in this obviously reduced Rugby Championship, just 3 weeks. Really quickly, the fixtures for you. I know most of you will know them by now, but this weekend, South Africa at home to Australia, and as I mentioned, Argentina hosting New Zealand. Then the second weekend, the following weekend, New Zealand at home to South Africa and Australia at home to Argentina. We then have a week's break, and then that final weekend at the end of July, Australia, New Zealand in Oz, and South Africa, Argentina in South Africa. So just the 3 rounds of fixtures. It will be very interesting to see how it goes. Let me get on to each individual team though. And as I say, this isn't really going to be about individual players, but more just a few points that I thought were interesting, the things that I'm probably most intrigued by and what springs to mind when I look at the Rugby Championship, the question marks, the uncertainty, the things of interest for those teams. So starting off with South Africa, I wonder if you'd agree with me on this. I think on paper, South Africa have the strongest squad overall. That's where I feel they are at the moment. They have got big injuries as well. Obviously, Sia Khaleesi is out. Andre Pollard is out, who had a really good end to the season with Leicester Tigers. So the captain, who you would probably expect to be the starting fly half, that's going to give opportunities in the back row. Maybe Marnie Libbok to get a real run of it at 10 as well at fly half. Massive responsibility on his shoulders. Would that change the game plan and the approach perhaps for the Springboks in terms of the skill set that he brings to the game? So I think there's interesting challenges for Rassie Erasmus and Jacques Nienaber to come over, but despite those big name players missing, I personally just look at that South Africa squad and I just think there is so much quality in it. And I also just think they've been a little bit more consistent over maybe the last year or so in terms of what they've been trying to do. You feel like this has been a South African squad that have been building. I remember it from what we saw in the autumn at the end of last year, that when they beat England at Twickenham, it wasn't just the power game. I know they did England at the scrum again a lot there, but it wasn't just the power game and the kicking game. They scored tries from distance, out wide. They've tried to add different layers to their game, South Africa, since the last World Cup. I think they believe that they're not necessarily going to be able to win the World Cup this year in exactly the same fashion as they did in 2019. They've tried to develop their game, so if they can continue to do that, I think their game's going to be in a pretty good place. If they can marry up the two different styles, if they can continue to have that power but also some more threat out wide, I think they're going to be pretty tough to beat. And I still think on their day, and you look ahead to the World Cup and you look ahead to Ireland and France, and in particular I look at, say, Leinster, for example, and how they've come unstuck at the end of the domestic season, it's been when they've been out-muscled, I think. And I wonder whether South Africa are a side that might be able to do that. But we'll wait and see. That's my thoughts on the Springboks. As for New Zealand, for once, they're not viewed as the outright favourite for the World Cup. Or, interestingly as well, despite their utter dominance of the Rugby Championship over the years, they often don't win it in World Cup years. 2019, 2015, 2011, they didn't win it. And they're not necessarily viewed as underdogs, are they? Because I think they're still so good. They're still contenders. Most people would have them in their top 4 teams of who could win the World Cup. But I think there are question marks there, because we saw last year, defeats in a series to Ireland, a loss at home to Argentina, but then they finished on 7-match unbeaten run to end the year. Disappointing draw at Twickenham after looking like they were leading pretty comfortably. But you look at that New Zealand squad and it's got so many good players in it. It's got an awful lot of experience in it still as well. And it's really whether Ian Foster, and maybe the question mark here is what Ian Foster can do. I know a lot of people in New Zealand still not convinced by him, but the question of whether he can get this squad moving in a direction that can have them winning the Rugby Championship and then looking further afield, possibly to win the World Cup. I think it is how he is able to mould that team together to work out the best team that can go and do a job. Because on their day, New Zealand can still beat anyone, I think. It's just maybe that consistency is what we haven't seen recently. And so the question for them really is that something they're able to generate, something they can find, I suppose. And the Rugby Championship is the first building blocks on the way to doing that. Can they work out their best combinations, I suppose, in some of those areas that maybe they're just not certain about? So that's New Zealand. I think them and South Africa, I would imagine it will be between those two who wins the Rugby Championship. But, and there's a big but here, and that's Australia. And I think at this moment in time, Australia are the most intriguing side in international rugby, purely because of the big question of what are they going to look like under Eddie Jones. Under Dave Rennie, they had I think it was 36% or in the 30s in terms of their win percentage. They'd have some really good performances and look really encouraging. It looked like they were bringing young players through into the squad, and then they'd have some disappointing results. They were plagued by inconsistency. And the Eddie Jones factor, whatever you think of Eddie Jones, is he has a track record at World Cups and he has a track record of coming in and getting an immediate bounce out of a squad. So could they upset South Africa and New Zealand in this Rugby Championship? We'll wait and see. But also, what sort of shape can he get them in heading into that World Cup? I think it's going to be fascinating. There's one thing in terms of play style I wanted to mention here. I watched Eddie Jones's press conference that they seemed to do literally in the airport before they flew out to South Africa the other day. I saw it. Seemed like a strange place to be doing the press conference. They were literally just punters and members of the public walking past looking a little bit bemused. But the one thing I took away from that interview that Eddie Jones said in terms of their playing style was they want to pass shorter and run straighter. And Eddie Jones comes out with a lot of, you could call it nonsense or mind games or narratives he wants to spin. Every so often, he comes out of real gems. If you actually watch how they play, I think that gives a real indication of simplifying the game plan, passing shorter, running straighter. And he then said, rather than going wide early on, they essentially want to earn the right to do that. Get back to that confrontational style that Australia used to have. They probably had it under Eddie Jones back when he was previously their coach. And then try and exploit what is available out wide rather than going there earlier in their attack. I thought that was really interesting, and I think that's something to keep an eye on for how Australia approach the games. Will it have an impact immediately? I'm really interested, really intrigued to see if that is the case. So yeah, I think it's going to be subtle changes for Australia, which they hope will produce big results. And yeah, in particular, more confrontational under Eddie Jones. In terms of their fixtures, it's tough first up against South Africa. Again, what team does South Africa name is going to be interesting. Then they're at home to Argentina. They'll back themselves to win that. And at home to New Zealand, who they very almost beat last year in the Rugby Championship. That game we remember with the free kick that was overturned right at the end, and then New Zealand scored a try to win it. So who knows with the Aussies? I think I can't quite put them up there with the All Blacks and South Africa just because there's too much uncertainty. But it's an Eddie Jones team. Quite frankly, you never quite know. Let's just finish up on Argentina. Really mixed set of results last year for the Pumas. Victory away in New Zealand, brilliant win against England at Twickenham at the start of the autumn, and then they finished their year with defeats to Wales and Scotland, who are sides, well, particularly Wales anyway. I was at that game actually in Cardiff, and after what we saw at Twickenham, they were pretty disappointing, really. So yeah, it's tough, isn't it? I look at Argentina and some of their players are brilliant. You know, Pablo Matera, Julian Montoya, Emiliano Buffelli, arguably the best fullback in the world last year. They've got a lot of quality. Do they quite have the strength in depth there? I'm not too sure. I wouldn't be surprised if they're still at the bottom of the Rugby Championship come the end of this. But they're in a decent side of the World Cup draw. I think they've got England in their group and they beat England at Twickenham, so they'll feel pretty comfortable of maybe coming out on top of the group or certainly progressing from the group and then facing either Australia or Wales. So I think they're one of those teams, probably similar in a way actually to an England or something like that, that if they can get it right, they could end up having a really good World Cup. As for the Rugby Championship, I'm just not sure they're going to have too much of a say on the top end of the table again, unfortunately. That's my gut instinct with Argentina. So that's kind of my general thoughts on all 4 teams. You can let me know in the comments down below of what you make of those, what kind of stands out to you. Those were kind of the things when I was just jotting down bullet points literally in front of me for each side. Those are the things that sprung to mind for me that are interesting and to keep an eye on. But the Rugby Championship is here. I think it is extra intrigue because of the World Cup, and I'm looking forward to it getting underway. Drop a comment down below, like the video and subscribe to the channel as well, and I'll see you in the next one.